I spent years funding my family's luxury lifestyle, only to be forced to sit next to a dumpster at my brother's engagement party. That was the night I finally decided to burn the bridge. My name is Mark, and at 34, I have spent the better part of my adult life serving as the anchor for a family that seemed determined to drift out to sea. While my brother, Jax, was the neon sign blinking over South Beach, erratic, magnetic, and prone to burning out, I was the concrete foundation. I built a career in high-end real estate, kept my lifestyle disciplined, and managed the logistical chaos of our lives. My parents thrived on the performative warmth of my social elite, treating every gathering like a cover shoot for a magazine, while conveniently ignoring the cracks in our foundation. I was the one they called to secure the table at the hottest club, to bail them out when my father's speculative investments dipped, and to maintain the polite facade of a cohesive unit. I was a fixture in their lives, but never a focal point. I was the guy holding the camera, never the one invited to step into the frame. Growing up, Jax was the golden boy, a man who treated life like an endless festival. He moved from one failing startup to the next, fueled by a charisma that blinded our parents to his profound lack of substance. They celebrated his failures as learning experiences while viewing my steady, unglamorous successes as mere expectations. I financed their lifestyle, paid the premiums on their insurance, and arrived at every holiday with gifts they didn't appreciate, all while enduring the backhanded compliments about my lack of vibe or my obsession with work. I maintained the charade because I harbored a quiet, desperate hope that eventually, the sheer volume of my loyalty would force them to see me as an equal. The turning point was orchestrated against the backdrop of a humid, star-studded October evening. Jax had announced his engagement to a socialite named Sophia, a woman my mother immediately championed as the final piece of their pristine public image. They planned an engagement party at an exclusive, members-only rooftop lounge in Brickell, a venue that was far beyond their actual means. My mother contacted me with that familiar, saccharine urgency, requesting that I handle the logistics. I knew, with the cynical clarity of someone who had been burned a dozen times, that the money I was asked to front for the reservation would never return to my bank account. Yet, I agreed. I wanted to believe that this event would be the moment I was finally invited to the center of the circle. I prepared for the night with meticulous care, donning a bespoke linen suit and arriving at the rooftop with a vintage bottle of champagne intended for the couple. The venue was a masterclass in South Florida excess, gold leaf accents, ambient house music pulsing through the palms, and the skyline glittering like a jewelry box. When I entered the private terrace, I expected a level of acknowledgement commensurate with the effort I had put into the evening. Instead, Jax greeted me with a flippant, dismissive wave. He directed me away from the plush, velvet-covered seating reserved for the inner circle, gesturing toward a solitary, plastic chair squeezed into a cramped corner near the service entrance and the utilitarian waste bin. He spoke of the table being for family only, a biting irony that hung in the humid air. My parents offered no intervention, merely shifting their focus to the next glass of bubbly, while the rest of the party treated my presence as an inconvenience rather than a contribution. I stood there, the weight of the expensive champagne in my hand feeling like a leaden reminder of my own misplaced loyalty. I sat in the plastic chair, coat still on, a silent observer to a celebration I had single-handedly built, yet was being systematically erased from. I watched for hours as they toasted to their own image, ignoring my existence entirely. The climax of the charade arrived with the presentation of the check. The server, clearly sensing the imbalance in the room, bypassed the main table and approached me with the discreet leather folio. As he hovered, I could feel the eyes of the entire party, the friends who had enjoyed the open bar, the parents who had insisted on the expensive catering, and my brother, who had effectively hosted a lavish party on my dime, fixating on the exchange. Jax, with that familiar, hollow confidence that had carried him through 30 years of recklessness, made no move to intercept the bill. Instead, he loudly signaled that the financial responsibility rested with me, as if my role as the family's patron was as natural as the tide. The silence that followed was heavy with the humidity of the night and the sudden, sharp shift in power. I did not move to reach for my card. Instead, I leaned back. My expression settled into a calm that I had never allowed myself to display before. I explicitly stated that I would not be covering the bill, noting aloud that the arrangement was for family only. And since I had been relegated to the service corner, I was clearly not part of the inner circle. The atmosphere in the room crystallized into an uncomfortable, jagged tension. My parents looked on with a mixture of shock and dawning horror, their public-facing composure fraying at the edges. Jax attempted to frame my refusal as a pathetic outburst, a sensitive reaction to a harmless joke, but his words lacked their usual sting. I stood up, abandoning my coat, and made it clear that I would not be settling a debt for an event where I was treated as an invisible labor rather than a guest. As I made my exit, taking the stairs rather than waiting for the elevator, the adrenaline provided a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I walked out into the cooling night air of the city, feeling the weight of their expectations finally sliding off my shoulders. I returned to my apartment, a quiet sanctuary away from the performative madness, and braced myself for the inevitable fallout. My phone soon became a repository for their panic. Text messages from Jax, demanding a fix for his reputation. Emails from my mother, pleading for me to minimize the scandal. And a deluge of missed calls that I ignored with deliberate intent. The following days were defined by a strange, newfound peace. The illusion of my necessity had been shattered. I discovered, through a mutual contact, that the partner of my brother's fiancé was less than thrilled with the revelations of how the night had been orchestrated. The narrative that Jax had built, one where he was the generous, charismatic host, was crumbling under the weight of the reality of his deception. My family's attempts to force me back into the role of the safety net were failing, primarily because I had finally stopped providing the ground for them to land on. I watched from a distance as their social standing among the people they desperately wanted to impress began to erode, not because of anything I had done, but because their own lack of integrity had finally been forced into the light. I was no longer the silent financier. I was the observer of my own liberation, watching the machinery of their lives grind to a halt because the one gear they had taken for granted had simply stopped turning. The quiet that settled over the following weeks was not an empty silence, but a profound, resonant one. The family group chat, once a relentless stream of superficial demands and performative joy, had gone dormant. My mother's attempts to reach out were no longer delivered through group channels. They were sent via individual messages, though I left them unopened. The cracks in Jax's reality, however, were widening into chasms. Through rumors drifting through the Miami real estate circles, I heard that his engagement had completely unraveled. The father of his fiancée, a man who valued reputation above all else, had been appalled to learn the truth about the evening's financing and the deliberate cruelty shown to me. The wedding planning had ceased, the deposits were forfeited, and the lifestyle that Jax had been curating for his future had evaporated overnight. My aunt, a woman who usually remained detached from the family's more turbulent waters, reached out to me during this period. She was a powerhouse in the local interior design scene, someone who understood the value of reputation and the danger of building a structure on unstable ground. Our conversation was brief but illuminating. She acknowledged the absurdity of how I had been treated and expressed a grim satisfaction that the family's scaffolding had finally collapsed. She noted that my parents were frantic, their panic fueled by the loss of the social prestige that Jax's impending marriage had promised. It was a cold comfort, but it was the first time I felt that my reality was being validated by someone outside of my own head. Jax's final attempts to manipulate the situation were frantic. He transitioned from arrogance to a desperate, aggressive pleading, calling me at all hours to demand I help him navigate the wreckage of his damaged reputation. He still did not understand that the currency of our relationship had been devalued to zero. He viewed me as a tool that had malfunctioned, failing to grasp that I had simply stopped being a tool altogether. When he finally realized that I was not going to intervene, his tone shifted to a hollow bitterness. He accused me of harboring jealousy, of orchestrating his downfall out of a petty desire for revenge. I found his accusations not insulting, but deeply revealing. They highlighted the depth of his narcissism and his inability to fathom a world where I existed for any reason other than to support his trajectory. I took the initiative to dismantle the financial ties that had bound us for so long. I systematically closed the joint accounts he had been using as his personal safety net and ensured that no further access to my resources remained. When he discovered he could no longer use my credit to maintain his lifestyle, his reaction was a mixture of bewilderment and rage. He could not comprehend how I had gained the agency to cut him off. I didn't waste energy explaining the mechanics of my decision. I simply closed the door. The finality of those actions served as a silent punctuation mark to the years of service I had provided. I was no longer interested in their stories or their excuses. I was focused on building a life where my worth was not determined by my utility to others. The final revelation came in the form of a long-form email from Sophia, my brother's former fiancée. Her words were measured and heavy with the clarity that comes from walking away from a life built on distortions. She detailed how the curtain had been pulled back on the entire charade, the way Jax had lied about the origin of the party's funding, the systematic way he had minimized her concerns about his behavior, and the eventual realization that she was marrying a man who prioritized optics over human connection. She did not write to seek an alliance or to trade secrets. She wrote to acknowledge the truth. In her admission of blindness and her apology for the role she played in the social architecture of our family, I found a strange, unexpected grace. I was, for the first time, being seen not as an obstacle or a convenience, but as a person who had acted with a dignity that was otherwise absent from the room. The tension in our family eventually dulled into a cautious, distant normalcy. One Sunday, my mother arrived at my doorstep, not with the performative energy of the past, but with the hollowed-out demeanor of someone who had lost their bearings. She brought a simple meal, a quiet offering that felt less like a bribe and more like a surrender. We sat in the kitchen of my home, the space I had cultivated for myself, free from the noise of their expectations, and she finally dismantled the defenses she had spent years building. There were no longer any platitudes about being too sensitive or overreacting. She admitted that they had treated me as a permanent fixture, an infinite resource that would never demand a return on investment. It was an acknowledgement that I was never a member of the inner circle, but rather the scaffolding they had used to climb until it became too cumbersome to maintain. She didn't ask for forgiveness, and she didn't attempt to bridge the gap that now stood between us. She simply acknowledged the damage and the reality of my exclusion. As I watched her leave, I realized that I had already achieved the only outcome that mattered. I had stopped waiting for them to invite me to the table. I had stopped trying to earn my seat in a life that was never designed to hold me. I moved forward, not with the weight of their legacy, but with the lightness of my own design. I invested in my own growth, seeking the counsel of professionals to ensure that my boundaries remained ironclad. And I traveled, finally exploring the world on my own terms. I stopped being the emergency contact and became the main character of a story that I was finally allowed to write. I realized that my value was not in what I could provide for others, but in the internal strength required to stand alone when the alternative was to be part of a hollow structure. I am still the same man, but the context has shifted entirely. I no longer sit by the trash can, waiting for a nod of approval from a crowd that never truly looked at me. I have built my own table, and for the first time, I am the only one who needs to approve of the seat I am sitting in.